Hello, everyone, and welcome to TeleTalk episode number 6. I am Perry Flynn, the consultant to the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction in the area of speech-language pathology. And Tracy Ball, if you have been following our TeleTalks, Tracy Ball is my always co-host, and he works for Enable My Child, and he is not only my co-host, but he is also the producer of our TeleTalk episodes. And so today we are lucky to have our special guest, Dr. Karen Little, who is a consultant in policy monitoring and audit for the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. So Karen, thank you so much for joining us with your expertise in the area of policy and monitoring.
Yeah, my pleasure, Perry. Tracy, thank you for having me.
So I always mark today to let you know that all the information that we're going to provide for you is current as of today, which is October 16th of 2020. And applies to North Carolina, but may apply to many other states. We have quite a few viewers who are coming to us from other states. And as you all have become accustomed to, you know, the landscape in this COVID era changes from day to day. So we are going to give you the most current information as of today, but just know that that might change. So Tracy, I think we're ready to go on to the first slide. So Karen and I have both seen this person, Julie Weatherly, who is a lawyer, a special education lawyer, and I think I've even presented with her maybe. And she's a frequent presenter at ASHA conventions, and she is just a very practical, wise source of wisdom that has to do with all law special education. And she, in a recent presentation at CASE, sort of gave us these 4 priorities to consider in this strangest of all times. That our first priority is the health, safety, and welfare of the students and staff that we are involved with. Our second priority is to provide FAPE, a free appropriate public education, to as many students as possible, operating the best that you can in these difficult times. To document your efforts to operate in good faith and in the best interest of students all the time. Karen and I are both going to reiterate several times through the presentation how very important documenting in a consistent manner all of your efforts is, but Julie has encouraged us to do that as well. And that a compliance during a pandemic, that IDEA was not written for compliance in a pandemic. So just to consider that some of the requirements of IDEA, although they are not relaxed, didn't really apply to a pandemic kind of time. So excellent, Tracy. So Julie also encourages us to act with compassion, collaboratively, in a community, and be creative. So really think about those 4 C's as you provide the services that you do. And Karen's going to wrap us up today with some similar words of wisdom from our own section chief in policy monitoring and audit, Carol Ann Hudgens. But we'll jump right in. So Karen, lots of questions. I've had lots of questions. I know you have too, with people concerned about timelines and can we relax timelines a little bit? And you know, what is DPI and the federal government giving us for guidance about timelines?
Right. And what we remind people is that there have not been any waivers to the timelines from the Office of Special Education Programs, or OSEP. And so we have to remember that there are no changes. So our child fine timeline in North Carolina are 90 days. Our Part C to Part B transitions for all of our little students that we serve having those programs in place and implemented by their 3rd birthday, and those annual reviews of IEPs. Now, again, we'll share more that some of the information that has come from OSEP. So they're aware that there are challenges related to this stuff, but there are no waivers or changes at this point. So on the next slide, it reminds us also our obligation around annual meetings, Perry, as another one of our timelines. And what OSEP has recognized is the challenge around meeting face-to-face in person, how we used to in our brick and mortar buildings. And so just remembering and reminding everybody out there that, you know, that you can use alternate means, that you can use telephone, video conferences, different ways. You know, those are the 2 ways I think of off the top of my head,
Sure.
but lots of different ways that you can try to meet through alternative means. So.
Yeah, and you know, going back to what Julie Weatherly said before, look for creative ways. Those are the 2 ways that I think of too, Karen, to do it through phone or virtual means. You know, get everybody on a conference call together and hold that IEP meeting. But you guys may think, your LEAs and you individually may think of some other more creative ways to do that. But you know, try to hold those IEP meetings with the involvement of parents as you always would. And if you are unable to involve parents, you know, move forward as you would in regular times, but make sure that you've documented your multiple attempts to involve them in those meetings, and certainly keep them informed of all that happens.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yep. I've heard some creative examples from districts that are, you know, utilizing what resources they have. In other words, you may have a family without internet, so the computer that the school gives them may or may not be that helpful for that student or that family. So they've been able to create areas around the school where the parent can join, where they can leave a computer that is connected to the school Wi-Fi. The parent can sit outside, attend the meeting if the family's not able to be in the building, or the therapist and the students and the teachers can all be in one place. So there are some creative ways to go about having these meetings. Really, you're only limited by, you know, what technology and scheduling and resources you have.
Right. Tracy, I've even heard from at least one school district that I've worked with where some businesses, some community and local businesses were on board with opening up their Wi-Fi and making opportunities, particularly for downloading information and everything. So yes, I've heard of some very creative things being done.
You know, some LEAs are taking buses out into the community as bus hotspots.
Yep.
And so families can come just really outside of their front doors.
Right.
And the hotspots are so powerful that they can use that. So there are many creative ways. One of the silver linings, people are thinking very creatively to act in the best interest of kids.
Yep.
Definitely. All right, I'll move on to the next slide, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
So we always are considering our timelines around evaluations. And again, part of what OSEP has encouraged, that, you know, even if evaluations have been delayed, because again, we've got to make sure that we're keeping safety in mind all the time for our students and their families and our staff. But it's critical and most important to communicate with parents about what is happening and when. Particularly, you know, if we get calls here at the Department of Public Instruction Exceptional Children Division, it's when parents don't know what's going on and they feel like the communication has stopped. So it's critical that continues, that we continue to communicate with our parents. And then OSEP recognizes that we need to do our best to ensure what's right for children is done. They've suggested investigating the ability to conduct remote evaluations, and then working with the developers to ask questions about the impact on reliability and validity if you are having to use formal assessments. And then I always like to encourage folks to remember that multiple data sources, Perry, are critical as we're considering all of these pieces. So just really thinking about the data that we have, what data do we need, what are our questions, and just thinking about all these multiple sources as we're going through this.
Sure. Tracy, I think we got back a slide. I think we are on the slide that says timelines, evaluations at the top of it. There we go. There we go. So I had a couple things that I wanted to say at this slide. I get lots of questions about hearing screenings. Some people see that they might be able to do the assessments for speech language pathology through virtual means, but how will they conduct a hearing screening? And there really are no reliable or valid ways to conduct a hearing screening virtually. So I would encourage you not to do that. We do have 90 days in North Carolina to complete our evaluations, and perhaps in that 90 days, your school district will open up to a place where a student could come to the brick and mortar school and a hearing screening could be completed for even just that really quick period of time. That would be the best case scenario, and really the only one that works to conduct a typical hearing screening. You should not delay your moving forward just because of a hearing screening. If you have all of the data that you've collected and you feel like it is reliable and valid enough to make an eligibility determination, you should not delay that because of a hearing screening. Some data that you might consider that might suffice for hearing screening is if students have been mass screened within the past year, that would work. Or even if hearing screenings have been done on a student even past a year and no one has any concerns about that student's hearing right now, you could use that data, even if it's a bit old, to make your decisions now and then complete that hearing screening in times when we can do that. Yeah. Karen also talked about, I think briefly touched on the standard screenings here, the second bullet of this slide. And I would completely encourage you to do just that for the assessments that the standardized assessments that speech language pathologists provide. I would encourage you to check with the publishing company to find out about the reliability and validity of that assessment tool to be delivered through a virtual format. And many of those companies have that information on their website now because so many people have asked. And some are reliable and some are not. Not that you can't administer those and report the results with a grain of salt, but do not report them as completely reliable and valid information. Report them that the test was not administered in the way it was intended. But it may give you some important information. But especially in this time, I would encourage you to do non-standard assessments through a virtual format. There you could collect a language sample easily, a narrative sample. You can listen to students' articulation in connected speech. There are many ways in a non-standard way to continue to collect that evaluation evaluation information that may be really most educationally relevant. So I would encourage you to use those means. IDEA says that we should use a variety of assessment tools, and a variety of assessment tools is just not many standardized assessments. It is perhaps a standardized assessment. That is a good piece of information to have. It especially helps you with determining a disability, but then collect a language sample, do a narrative analysis, collect information about a student's articulation in connected speech, do some stimulability testing, do some dynamic assessment. I mean, there are many ways to conduct a really good evaluation all through non-standard. And yes, it could all be non-standard. If you and the IEP team feel like that is yielding strong information for you to make your eligibility decision, it's fine.
So Terry, where I went, because That is so critical that we are ensuring that the IEP team is considering all these different sources of data, and we may be considering data that in the past we might not have thought to look for. For example, like you said, a mass screening that may have occurred a year ago or 2 years ago that the IEP team could determine is current and relevant and can be used to support other sources of data in these times.
Yeah, great. I think we're ready for the next slide, Tracy.
Yeah.
So Karen, I've gotten tons, I know you have too,
Yeah.
tons of questions about compensatory services or makeup services for the periods of time when schools were closed, or in the situation that parents are not able to avail themselves of the services that we're providing. So I know you have lots of guidance for people here.
Right, right. And so what I wanted to talk about, Perry, when you and I had talked about how much we're hearing this question, is that OSEP originally started talking about from the beginning that IEP teams have to make individual determinations around these kinds of services. So they had issued a question and answer document back in March that where folks had asked about it back then. About what to do if schools are closed because of the COVID-19. And so originally from the beginning started talking about that it's going to be up to individual IEP teams to make that determination. And then I think more questions followed, because if we look at the next slide, NASD or our the compensatory services versus compensatory education, Tracy, that NASD, our National Association of State Directors of Special Education, really brought up the fact that historically, when we talk about compensatory education services, we're talking about that when there's been a denial of FAPE. So I think, Tracy's at the next slide. I don't know if maybe I'm just not there.
There we go.
We're talking about a possible denial of FAPE. And so oftentimes when we start talking about compensatory education services, we're talking about requirements that have been put in place because of a due process, a state complaint, mediation, and that we're doing that to address that non-compliance. But right now, these changes in services or services looking different are happening because of a pandemic, right? So if we go to the next slide, it's important to realize that when we're thinking about those services, compensatory services, that the United States Department of Education, OCR and OSERS, have understood, they've recognized that schools may not be able to provide all services in the same manner that they're typically provided. So I think that's critical when we start thinking about what are we going to do about these lapses this time. And again, that, FAPE may need to be different in this unprecedented time. I mean, I think that's really the right word for it. Because we've got to think about how we're providing FAPE, but we've still always got to keep forefront in our mind, just like Julie Weatherly encouraged us, the safety of everyone that's going to be involved. So
free appropriate public education is looking different for general education students as well as special education students.
Correct. Education, the landscape has just changed.
Sure.
Even the conversations around it have changed.
Right.
So, very much so. So what does that mean? So on our next slide, we're going to talk a little bit, Perry, about, so what are we talking about when we're talking about these services, right? Who's going to make these decisions? And again, NASD, or our National Association of State Directors of Special Education, really offered some further clarification on how to make these determinations in light of a pandemic, right? Because that's what's going on. And they reminded us that there's no regulatory requirement that requires or addresses that determination of the need for compensatory services by an IEP team, but it's not prohibited. So in this unique situation, the United States Department of Education guidance encouraged IEP teams to make determinations about whether and to what extent compensatory services may be needed. So IEP teams' primary focus has to stay with authentic engagement of the families, right? That communication that's so critical that we've been talking about, and their outcomes and what's been achieved, and reviewing your present levels of performance, making sure that you're looking at information before all of this happened, during with remote instruction, and after, examining progress on your goals, reviewing, revising, and then adding, maybe increasing your special education related services to ensure that each student individually benefits. So what I think keeps coming out is that it's an IEP team decision, and we've got to make individual decisions based on all of this kind of information.
So just one small addition to that slide before we go on, that I think fits here. I've gotten lots of questions about the plan of care in this time, and the plan of care represents the skilled interventions that the therapist will be using with the student, and many of the skilled interventions that you'll be using are the same ones you would be using if you were seeing them live. So it should be a flexible document. It may change over time if you are using different skilled interventions, because the student is not making progress at the same rate that they had before. You might want to revisit the plan of care and revise it. But if you're doing all the same skilled interventions you were doing in a face-to-face format, that is not necessary.
Yeah, and the United States Department of Education has related guidance on their COVID-19 information page that describes specific instances when schools must make individual determinations whether and to what extent compensatory services might be needed. So there's a lot of good resources out there too to help in all this. So when we're thinking about that, so some of the questions that I've gotten, Perry, is, well, then how do we help with these decisions? And so when we look at that next slide, originally the division, our EC division here at NCDPI, we originally issued some guidance back in April, really emphasizing that need around continuing to document. Really making sure that you're documenting your conversations with students, with families regarding the services and the services offered, the services delivered, and how kids are making progress. And really making sure that we are carefully documenting and monitoring the changes, so that as services change, as school district instructional plans changed, that we made sure our services were aligning with what were in those contingency plans. And again, documenting all of that. And then maintaining all of that data for once we get back to normal, or once we get back face-to-face in our brick and mortar settings, so that we've monitored all of that. And then, so as we're doing all of that, some key points to think about now, right, is what we're going to want to do is take all of that data that we've been encouraging everybody to keep collecting, and we're going to want to analyze all of that now in light of the progress. So we want to think about what happened, what was going on when the schools closed back in March, what was going on during remote learning, and make sure that we're, again, talking to parents, considering their input about progress that's been made and all the data that's been gathered. And then considering all the data that we're gathering when our kids are coming back to school. And then what we're going to do is take all that data, and just like we always would, develop really good present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, or our PLAFs. And we're going to update all of that as we analyze all those data. And then our IEP teams will have to make the decisions about whether or not additional or more intensive services, referred to as compensatory services in that OSEP Q&A document, or do students require different specially designed instruction and related services based on each individual student's unique needs in light of the district's now reopening. So again, so critical that individual decisions are being made. And that's really what the next slide is about, is just reminding folks that that IEP team determines what's required for FAPE, based on that class, and as a result of a lack of progress, if any, during school closures and remote learning. So
Yeah.
just that reminder.
I think what's interesting here is that some students may actually make more progress and some students may actually make less progress, depending on the situation at home and how much support they have and what their structure is, because there are certain scenarios by which students may have, for all intensive purposes, a full-time aide, teacher, or mentor that could be in the form of a parent or
Very
in a
true.
pod. Like my kids are in a pod, so they go to school with, you know, it's 6 of them, and we have a full-time teacher, and we're very lucky to be able to do that. But other students, you know, I know friends of ours that really struggle at home to figure out how to, you know, both work as a parent and provide the right educational support for their child. Like you mentioned earlier, I think, Karen, somebody bouncing back and forth between calls where a family may be, you know, working on, like a parent may be working, but then they may also be sharing time trying to help their child on classroom calls or something like that. So it's important, no matter how great the state guidance is, the local decision making really is just supported by the state guidelines. And I think that is something that is both a blessing and it can also be difficult. And so just acknowledging that is important.
Yeah, to your point, Tracy, you know, I've talked about this in earlier episodes that my graduate students and I are seeing some students that we would see in an equestrian therapy program, but we are seeing them in their homes with their parents, you know, as the facilitator, and we are leaving homework and they are doing it and they are making fantastic progress because, like you said, they have their own sort of one-on-one all the time in the shape of their parent.
Yeah.
And
And
one augmented communication user has made tremendous progress in using his device, because I want to take some credit for our graduate students modeling that and talking the parent through it in the sessions that we've done there. Yeah, there are some silver linings in the progress that kids are making too.
Right. Definitely some teachers have shared that some students have really engaged well with remote learning at different points. So there may not be a loss of progress for some of those kiddos that have engaged well with remote learning.
Yep, that's right. I'll move on. I just wanted to make that point. Thank you for bearing with
Karen,
me.
I am sure you've had lots of these kinds of questions too about scheduling services when parents aren't replying, or, you know, so what is your guidance? Your guidance is my guidance. What is our guidance on that?
Well, Perry, you know, I'm always going to point back to policy because, again, there's not a change in policy for what our requirements are, our due diligence in trying to encourage and convince parents to be involved. But again, you know, as we've shared and we've talked about that compassion, understanding the challenging situations that are out there right now, as we work through everything that is the COVID-19. Just remembering that you're going to want to always, if you're not getting a reply, refer to policies and to your local education agencies, your school district's procedures for no response, because your school district can have those typical procedures that you would normally do, following up with phone calls, sending emails, sending letters, different things like that. And then if there's still no reply, you're going to want to keep following up, keep documenting that. You want to be consistent with your LEA's requirements for attendance, right? Because there's still requirements that your school district has around that. And then follow your procedures for in-person instruction. So you may need to, you know, if a student isn't participating, I know I've seen where students refuse to participate in a speech therapy session. You couldn't let that continue without considering, do we need to review and revise and consider other options for the student, or what do we need to do to address that? So there may be different ways that you can work around that with, like, for example, flexible scheduling is the example on the slide. So, but you're going to want to remember that if you've got your IEP, your contingency plan that says we're providing these kinds of services, that you're going to want to keep following that schedule and keep documenting what's happening around your trying to provide all of those services. That's really critical.
Yeah, that documenting and periodic attempts. You know, we don't want to annoy parents with daily attempts, but you know, we've talked about this earlier too, that they may be struggling with caring for an older adult in their home and trying to work, and they may have many competing priorities right now, and speech therapy sessions might be at the bottom of that list. So, you know, just with compassion, continue to be in touch with them and offer our services. And if down the road they're able to avail themselves of it, that's fantastic. But
I have a quick question on this. I know we're talking policy, which sometimes seems very 20,000 foot view, but as a clinician, I want to ask a question, and this may not be easy to answer, but how do you recommend they document that? Are we documenting that as a North Carolina therapist right into our IEP documentation wizard? Are we documenting it at the school level? I just want to make sure people understand where would they best, you know, document that at, because I think it's important just to call out some of that. Yeah.
Great suggestion. I'll let Karen answer it, but I have some thoughts too.
Yeah, and I think that what's critical is most school districts would have in place the methods that they would like their educational staff, all of their folks, to be documenting that information. And especially in light of what's going on now, where people may be doing the instruction remotely for students that are remote in different places, they may have specific locations and methods that they want followed. So I think that that's the number one guidance I would say, is check with your director, your administrator, whomever it is that you need to that's reminding you that you need to collect that, to make sure you're meeting with what they're saying that you need to do. So
that's exactly what I was going to say, Karen. I think documentation is so important right now that LEAs have really handled that. Communication and documentation. And I think most LEAs have a real clear procedure, protocols for how to communicate, how often to communicate, and how to document those communications.
And then where that's going to be kept and stored and retained also. So.
Yeah,
perfect.
Okay.
So Karen and I talked about this, about collecting and contributing data to the state performance plan. And I think many speech language pathologists don't. This is another one of those like huge big picture things, but I don't think that many SLPs know that they contribute to this data, and having the benefit of a policy monitoring and audit consultant, I thought it was wise to talk about this. And so Karen prepared this slide about the different indicators, and she'll explain those. And I think that speech pathologists will see their role in contributing to this data, which is what we report from the DPI level to the OSEP level.
Right. And I think that that's really important, Perry, that you know, I always like to tell the school districts that I work with that your data is my data, right? And that when that your data, for example, I'm going to pick indicator 11, our child find data, which when we talk about indicator 11, then you know, we're talking about the percentage of children that are evaluated within our timelines, right, for initial evaluations. And I know your speech pathologists and speech pathologists everywhere really contribute to that. So sure. when we're collecting that data from our school district, we compile it as a state, and it becomes our state data. So we are also looking at that and going, we know that timelines have been missed because of what has been going on. Again, considering safety and the well-being of everyone and health. So I think it's just important to know that that everyone is aware of that, and that there is a big picture look at all of this, because I think when some of this we first started seeing schools closing, and then the different scenarios that followed with that, people were really concerned. And sometimes I think I had to step back and remind myself that, you know, this is bigger than just the area that I work with in North Carolina. This is bigger than North Carolina. This is really even bigger than the United States. You know, this is the world is dealing with all of this. So it's not like OSEP doesn't recognize that our indicator data that we collect from our school district is not going to be impacted or affected by all of this. And I think that was really what the point that I wanted to make, because I always appreciate a characteristic that I've encountered frequently in working with speech pathologists, is that they are very cognizant and conscientious around assessing students and evaluating students and meeting timelines and trying to do all those things, being aware that, you know, we want to get services in place for kids that need those services, and how critical that is. So, but, you know, OSEP has said, like indicator 4, suspensions and expulsions, and you may not be directly involved in that in your work as a speech pathologist, but you can be, because we look at, you know, is there disproportionality there? That can be affected, right? Because we've changed environments. Indicator 5 is whether or not is where students are inside of that regular like classroom, or if they are, for example, removed to separate schools and separate settings. So, you know, gosh, there's been lots of conversation around even what LRE looks like in remote learning environments and different components like that. And then of course, indicator 11, I just pointed out around our initial timelines. And then 12, those movement of from part C to part B, and getting all of those kids going, identified, and services in place. So, I mean, they're aware of those kinds of things. We're aware of those kinds of things as a state as we're collecting that data. So just know that. That doesn't make you feel better about things that maybe are being missed or impacted by this, but just an awareness that you know, we know that this is going on. So.
Yeah, just a couple thoughts there. Thank you first for acknowledging the conscientiousness of speech language pathologists. I recognize that myself, and I say all the time that I am so lucky to work in North Carolina with the level of professionalism of our workforce in speech language pathology. But certainly, speech pathologists see their role in contributing to indicators 5, 11, and 12. I hope that you're now aware of that and more clear about how you, on a daily basis, are contributing to the data that is reported to the federal government in those areas.
Yeah. Oh, and
so,
too, Carrie, I forgot. Yeah, sure. Sorry to interrupt you. That, you know, like a really extreme example of that is indicator 3 is performance on those statewide assessments, and you know, all the states got waivers, and there weren't statewide assessments, so there won't be data for that from this year.
Right.
So, I mean, it's just right. An indication that this is really has a big impact, and that everybody's aware of that. So, and we do what's right for kids.
So I think we've reached the sort of end of our time together, and Karen has a concluding slide, and then I'll say my goodbyes.
Yeah, I have stolen this from my section chief because I just thought that it really resonated with me. And I just tweaked it because I've just been thinking about, Perry, as we talked through all of this, in considering, like Julie Weatherly said, you know, the policy was not written for a pandemic. So I think our best recipe is, we're always going to start with policy. And I reach over here because here's my nice book right here. We're always going to start with that policy. But then, as Carol Ann talked about, we still want to make sure we're mixing in common sense with care and compassion in this time, because there's just so much going on. So
great. So that's going to conclude our 6th episode of TeleTalk. I always appreciate Tracy's help with them, and And as our producer today and of all the episodes, and special thanks to Karen Little, who is the policy monitoring and audit consultant that's been with us for this episode. But I also want to do a shout out to all of policy monitoring and audit, because you support the work that we do, and they are so great about helping me answer questions for you all in the field. And if I'm stumped, they are the deal breakers to come up with the definitive answer for you. So I appreciate all of policy monitoring and audit. And so as always, it is a great group. We are so lucky to have all of you to keep us on the straight and narrow and out of jail and out of trouble. So I'll end the episode, as I always do, with thanking all of you for what you're doing in these unprecedented times to act in the best interest of kids. I hope that you will take care of yourselves and your families, and I'll look forward. I am increasingly more making some appearances virtually in LEAs, and so I'll look forward to seeing many of you on those appearances in the upcoming months. So take care and goodbye.
Thanks for your kind words, Terry. And I've enjoyed the opportunity. Thanks, Tracy.
Thank you for joining us. All right, everybody, I'm going to sign off.